unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. On Sunday night, India's new National Democratic Alliance government was sworn into office with Prime Minister Narendra Modi at its helm one more time. We have a new group of BJP allies, a new group of ministers, and a new look in terms of how the Modi government will function in its third term. However, the economic challenges the new government faces are quite old. Many experts believe that concerns about inflation, jobs, and lack of upward mobility dented the BJP's electoral prospects in the recent general election. To talk about the Indian economy and the steps the new government must take, I'm joined on the show this week by Trinh Nguyen. Trinh is a senior economist covering emerging Asia at Natixis, based in Hong Kong, where she surveys economic trends across Asia, including in India. She previously worked at HSBC as an ASEAN economist from 2011 to 2015. She's also a non-resident scholar in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment. I am pleased to welcome her to the show for the very first time. Trinh, so good to see you.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I'm very excited about this conversation. Many of our listeners will know that in recent weeks and months, you have gone viral in India for your data-backed Twitter threads. And so we are going to dig into some of those. But before we do that, we are, of course, recording this just a week or so after the general election results have come out. On June 5th, once we found those results, you tweeted the following: "Instead of a landslide, we got earthquakes. In India, this is not a change of government, but how Modi will govern." We got some clarity on the makeup of the cabinet last night. We don't know which minister has which portfolio, but we have a sense of what this government is going to look like. Let me just ask you kind of a big macro question. How are the markets viewing this quote-unquote earthquake so far?
Well, I think after reassessment, it realized that, well, it's still Modi. So there is continuity. So it's not as much of an earthquake. It's an earthquake in terms of expectations, right? And so much of that was priced in. So people had expected that he would win by a landslide, especially after the exit polls. And what that means is that people had expected him to be able to roll through reforms unabated, unobstructed, given the much even stronger mandate than he had before. So let's remember that in the first and the second term, he won and able to govern without forming a coalition. And even then, he struggled in the first term with land reform. And even though labor reform has been passed to allow the number of employees to increase from 100 to 300, be able to fire them without involving the government, there's still a lot of challenges within India. One example is that farmers reform that he tried to do, that he had to backtrack. So there was a lot of enthusiasm of what Modi can accomplish in the third term, given the fact he already had the government. And now one of the reasons why it's viewed as an earthquake is that it's actually he performed much weaker than the previous two terms in terms of results. So people had to recalibrate that expectation in terms of what he will be able to achieve and how he will be able to achieve that in the third term. Because many people see that, he built a foundation for growth, but next, he actually built the actual growth itself. And as you know that India has done a great job in terms of improving fiscal current account balance. So these are just, areas that the country needs to be more sustainable. But obviously, you need to continue to move forward and deliver on the job front. And that part is quite difficult to do and require a lot of reforms, which require you to have a very strong government.
So let me just, before we get into kind of what the government might do or needs to do, let me just ask you about the economics underlying this election. And I want to draw on something you wrote in a recent research note where you said the following: during the Modi decade, 2014 to 2024, India GDP per capita increased 64% to $2,500. Much of that is thanks to fast growth, driven by government infrastructure spending and effective disbursement of social welfare programs, such as free food to 813 million people. Now, despite this, many experts believe the economy was a key vulnerability for the BJP this election, and voters punished them for it. How do you see things? What do you think the vulnerable spots are in the economy as things stand today?
Right. There is a disconnect of how markets see the economy and how an ordinary person see it, right? And let me just explain first the progress Modi has made, and I would then move on to say what's missing, right? And then we can then go on to then see why people weren't as impressed as investors. First, much of the progress is on first the fiscal side. So Modi introduced the GST, that basically raised the tax revenue ratios. And as a result of that, he also expanded how the government spend money, right? Basically, there's a big doubling of government capex, and within that government investment, a lot of that was spent on infrastructure, particularly highways, right? So India built highway roads in the previous under the previous opposition government, but actually, what's different here is that we actually build roads that connect different areas. There's an attempt to connect Delhi and Mumbai, for example, so on and so forth. So this is quite important. So we don't just build infrastructure, but the goal is to connect. And that's a problem for India because the connectivity is a challenge. The second aspect that he did was the expansion of investment via renewable, so through fiscal spending and also through policy support. And that itself has actually caused a lot of positive and enthusiasm for investors because finally we're having a government that is focusing on something that's missing. Now, the second area I think India has done pretty well was on its external balances. So what does that mean? External balance is India's relationship with the world in terms of payments, right? Capital flows. Now, on the current account, which is an income side, which is basically net exports, so net of trade, merchandise trade, and net services, and income flows, which is remittances and net corporate flows. That was a huge deficit. So 5 years before Modi came into power, that average was minus 3.5% of GDP. Now that declined to less than 1% during the Modi period. So that's quite positive. A lot of it is due to decline of goods deficit, particularly in manufactured goods deficit, particularly in machinery. And also fuels decline and less import of gold, right? And then so both of these things, and while services remain positive with the transformation of less service transport import. Now, what does that mean? That means that India no longer live hand to mouth, right? Because it only needed to borrow from the rest of the world less than 1% of GDP. Whether or not foreign investors wanted to buy Indian equities or Indian bonds or go in and flow money through India via long-term investment through FDI matter, but it didn't matter as much because its funding gap, which used to be minus 3.5% of GDP, was less than 1%, right? And as a result, that you can see that the INR and the central bank itself was able to accumulate reserves. So India was no longer vulnerable. It was not vulnerable during the energy crisis, thanks to this capex investment to expand the supply of energy beyond fossil fuel, right? Particularly LNG. So you can say that the juxtaposition of Pakistan, which actually doesn't have energy diversification and entirely reliance on LNG and had to compete with rich Europe, actually went dark, right? So the fact that it was diversified really helped India. And a country like India really needs to focus on this because it's basically the bloodline of any economy. And without energy, you're going to go dark in terms of consumption, industrialization, and so on and so forth. So this input cost for India used to be a huge challenge doing business in India is less of an issue, right? We still have a lot of demand and supply will continue to grow. So these two areas are what I would say key optimism.
So, Trinh, I'm totally with you on the optimism, but could you just say a bit more about the disconnect between the impressive headline numbers and the feeling on the ground?
So when you then zoom out in this picture on why there is a disconnect between, say, the financial markets and ordinary people, one would say that while Modi did a great job of building this foundation for growth, which makes India much more resilient, he still needs to still link that to then grow the export side of the equation, right? To grow, the next stage would be to then grow the capex cycle to the private sector so that we have a job growth, right? And then from job growth is where you actually link it to the ordinary people. And the second thing one would say is that, one of the arguments people say during the elections is that Modi's growth was jobless. That's actually not true. It actually generated a lot of jobs because you can see it in the direct taxation. It's just it generated a lot of high skilled jobs, right? One of the interesting things about India, which people talk about, which is, it's the number one most populous country in the world, which is going to be more populous in the future, and so on and so forth. Its comparative advantage in the global marketplace is really the number of people it has, not just for the demand side, but supply side, should it want to, compete in labor-intensive manufacturing. Now, actually, it doesn't compete in labor-intensive manufacturing. If you look at its exports, even if we talk about the fact that it punches below its weight, it's mostly capital intensive, right? We think Indian pharmaceuticals, we think Indian high tech, we think Indian services in IT, we think Indian services in businesses, right? These are all high skilled, which means that the job growth that what was generated during the Modi period help create an increase in formalization, help increase the taxation, help the institutionalization of financialization of India and so on and so forth, that we see the progress in financial markets. But we have a lot of people in India, right? So even if we create a lot of job services, if we manage to do these things, we're basically not touching enough people. Most of Indian employment is informal, right? Excluding our culture sector, the largest generator of jobs during this Modi period, according to ILO, is really the construction sector. Manufacturing generates a lot of jobs as well. And services generate jobs, but the scale of this generation is very, very little. And more importantly, there are still roughly 250 million people working in the art culture sector, which is the sector that employs the most number of people in India. So that is a sector that's more salient, and that's an area that's much more difficult to touch because we haven't generated enough low skill labor intensive jobs. And moreover, it's an area of reforms where Modi didn't have as much success, right?
So, before we kind of get into the jobs question, just a couple more things on macro, which is, if we just step back for a second, Trinh, you do comparative research across Asia. So you are looking not just at within countries, but you're also looking at regional trends. And I wonder if you could just kind of give us a sense, if you were to just take the last decade, 2014 to 2024 as your benchmark, how has India performed in broad macro terms relative to, kind of Asian peers and competitors? Yeah.
Indonesia. Yeah. Okay. So I think a country that you should compare Indonesia with is Indonesia. So investors tend to think of two buckets, right? One is you invest in Indian government bonds, namely the sovereign, which is the Indian government bonds, right? Or you invest in Indian equities, which is, Indian corporates, right? Now listen, in when you look at India, right? Its tax revenue ratios improve a lot, right? So it now surpassed Indonesia as a share of GDP. So that's a significant increase. Its GDP per capita increased a lot, but it's still the lowest within the countries that we look at. But GDP per capita is a benchmark, but it doesn't look at inequality and so on and so forth, right? We just take the output divided by the population. Now, I think one thing I would say is that India, we should have to say the way investors look at a country is that on a relative basis, how it has done. So relative to itself and relative to other people. So relative to itself, it has improved significantly. As I mentioned before, if you look at 2014, which is right after Fed tapering tantrum, which is basically when the Fed tried to raise interest rates, and everyone was really scared because a lot of money flow from developed markets where interest rates and growth were pretty low thanks to this QE and zero interest rate and so on and so forth, and went into all these emerging markets and feeling bubbles, right? And so as a result, during this period, India then imported a lot. The fiscal deficit went to a lot, which is when we talk about the current account deficit being really massive, is that growth was unsustainable, right? It was overheating the economy. So when you borrow so much to then consume, invest, then you have a problem if the investors no longer want to invest. So growth was very unsustainable for India during this period. And it went through a very difficult period after that, right? Which you have to then start tightening the balance sheets and rebalance your economy. So I would say that relative to that period, when you look at India today, that's not the picture we have, right? That's why we started with this. Which is that it no longer was living hand to mouth. It actually doesn't need to borrow from a bond perspective. In fact, it's being included in the JP Morgan index because it kicked out Russia. So the country that's obvious to be included is India because it's so large. And so on and so forth. And it's performing better on these metrics. And so investors want exposure and it's being included, right? And so therefore you're going to have increased inflows, not because the Indian government needs it, but it also would then alleviate a lot of these funding constraints I said earlier, which is that the crowding out effect. So there's going to be more liquidity. The second thing is that you have to think about how resilient a country is to shocks, right? So we're basically just talking macro here, which means that during any period that the Central Bank of India has the ability, because it's beefed up so much reserves, to decide what it wants to do, right? And what it has decided in recent years is instead of allowing for the INR to appreciate, it actually was buying beefing up its reserves. So this is a central bank that's no longer beholden to the market and the whims of foreign investors, but actually take directions, which then the U.S. and etc. can have issues with the fact that it's trying to stabilize the economy. But in other words, it's behaving less of an emerging market that is very vulnerable to any external shock. So I would say that that's the key difference of India in 2024 today.
I want to just ask you here about the importance of coalition government, because you have optimists who believe that coalition government won't change very much when it comes to the economic reform program. You have pessimists who believe that it's going to make everything much more difficult. You had a recent note in which you said, yes, coalition government is likely to make reforms a much slower process. But actually, when you think about, big scale reform having to do with agriculture, land, labor, um, if you are able to have a consensus with the coalition government, these reforms are more likely to be sustainable. Tell us a little bit more about the silver lining.
Absolutely, right. So I think it would mean that so we talked about we just said that farming didn't happen, right? So that's a reform that even with under a government that didn't need a coalition failed, right? Right, because they realized that politically it's too difficult. It was necessary, but it's politically too difficult because the farmers have doubt, right? They have doubt that they're able to sell to the private market, the marketplace without the government support and so on and so forth, because they worry that, and so on and so forth. Now, let's talk about something that went through, which is the demonetization of the economy, which actually was announced and was abruptly implemented, right? Or even, I would argue, the COVID lockdown that happened, right? And, at the time, India got a lot of slack for it. And it was very messily implemented, I would argue, from afar. But eventually everyone did the same. So kind of people forgot about it, right? But let's not forget, we zoom out, there was a huge contraction of the economy. And of course, it has consequence, right? So if you look at the economic cost of that, that was quite severe. So I would argue that yes, and one of the beauties I would say about a democracy and the negatives that people tend to talk about relative to authoritarian regime is that it moves very slowly because you have these, checks and balances and so on and so forth. So I think in a coalition government, I think the difference here is that Modi has to ensure that he has a coalition, right? So one of the worries that people have in the markets is that to ensure that the support that he has doesn't veer away and go towards another the opposition, is that he has to give more welfareism, so to speak, and less of this capex that he has. So that's basically the biggest worry people have, which is fiscal slippage, right? And I would argue that it's first of all, welfareism existed under Modi in the second term because that green handout, and he already promised he's going to continue, right? And fertilizer is something that it's absolutely necessary in India, as I just mentioned. It's an important sector. Food security is important, and the farmers themselves are important because they make up a large part of India, where most of the people live, and that's still the number one employment, even if it's low yielding and as a contribution to the economy. So that's positive. I think the negative, of course, is that you need to push through. If you want to push through something very difficult, it's going to be very difficult. But the past tells us that it's still difficult anyway, right? So I would argue that maybe if you zoom out in a larger picture, maybe the smart thing to do is how do we get through the low hanging fruits, right? So for example, in land reforms, perhaps it would be difficult to completely push through land reform right now, but we still have things to do like the digitalization, right? Titles and so on and so forth, which continues to be a big issue in India. You have issue like transaction taxes are too high, right? Obviously that generates revenue, but it's still very high and can be very challenging. So we still have a lot of red tape that we can fix, So I would argue that maybe perhaps it will make one be more creative. And if Modi is still committed to reforms, which I think he is, then he can then start working on the low hanging fruit. And actually, essentially, that's what Modi did anyway, right? After he realized very quickly he won the government in 2015 after he failed the land reform. You read the Financial Times article on that. It was very scathing, right? The comments were made. Now that we sit in 2024, when people think of him as Mr. Reform, and disappointed that he didn't gain enough power to further reform. Well, I guess it depends on who you are. Maybe celebrated if you don't like him and his friends. But the point here is that when that happened, the critique is that he really failed and that there was a lot of optimism for him coming through, and he didn't deliver, right? And I think political lesson he learned from that, I'm not a political, and I can't even pretend to say that I know anything about this, but I would imagine the fact that he's able to push through a lot of things later on, is through thinking, instead of doing big bang reforms, perhaps within the big bang reforms that we want to do, what can we do? And I would say there's plenty to do.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So could I just ask you, you mentioned about what needs to happen for investors, particularly foreign investors. I think one of the puzzles, and we've talked about this with previous guests as well, is this question on FDI, right? Which is that India is in this geopolitical sweet spot. It has political stability. People are looking to de-risk or deleverage from China. But FDI in India has dropped significantly, even as a share of overall emerging market FDI. Is that a concern? Do you think this is just a blip? How do you make sense of that? What seems like a paradox.
Okay, so let me just zoom out. So first, FDI globally has been abysmal. Because as you know, the Fed raised rates is now the upper bound 5.5%. When risk-free rates is so high, people feel a bit uncertain, right? And the geopolitical climate and so on and so forth, right? And I would say but within India, in the context of India, so if you think about Southeast Asia, a lot of countries, FDI has been declining in the past recent years. There are few countries, however, continues to be a superstar of FDI. Vietnam is one, right? Indonesia is pretty good. Indonesia tends to attract more metals and mining, which because it's resource rich. So Indonesia is not a manufacturer of FDI star either. It's just a star in the sectors it target. Vietnam is a star for labor-intensive manufacturing and high tech. And then of course there's India, which was a star for ICT sector. So if you look at India FDI, which it grew pretty fast. And the strong sectors are always strong, right? Like the ICT sectors usually attract most of the FDI. This is an area where India excel, right? And IT export service was number 2, just right behind Ireland. And so it attracts that. Manufacturing FDI is very, very little relative to India, right? Size. And that remains to be growing. So that's something that when people talk about FDI, they tend to think about the gross number. And then that gross number went from really big to then decline, right? Now that FDI, of course, as you know, there's greenfield. Greenfield means like an investor actually. First of all, what is FDI, right? FDI is, by technical definition, more than 10% ownership of securities, right? So which means you go in, you buy more than 10% of a company, right? So you can do it through M&A, mergers and acquisitions. You can do it through actually going in and build a factory, right? So obviously what you really want is like someone actually going in and actually building a factory. Not that there's nothing wrong with M&A, but the building of a factory is where you get a lot of the skills that you want. When they go in, they actually create a new factory. You can then have more headcount demand and so on and so forth, right? So for India, that FDI superstar has always been ICT. You've heard a lot of big deals that came through. Now that declined because that cycle became more interest rate sensitive, right? Because work from home made it really a big hit to then invest in India, and then work from home made it necessary to not outsource so much. And the IT sector itself suffer a little bit, but manufacturing remains a weak spot. So why is that the case? Why is manufacturing and how is this related to investors' optimism? Because people believe that, and they rightly so, that's the missing link for India to make the leap from growing 6.5 to 8-ish%, right? So if you look at India growth in recent quarters, you have consumption and investment. So consumption in a country like India, where demand tends, first you have growing population, and so consumption itself is relatively sticky and will grow because what you demand is relatively inelastic. So essentials, right? And then you're just going to demand more of it, right? Now, so then exports go up and down, depends on global trade cycle, and either way, exports of merchandise is not huge anyway. So even in the years where there's a huge contraction of export, India growth still champion ahead in fastest growth in Asia and so on and so forth. So it's really what people want is really this investment cycle pickup, and that's picking up, right? So if you look at the details of growth, it's really consumption remains resilient and the picking up of this investment.
Could I just ask you to pause on that for a moment? Because when you say picking up of investment, where exactly in the economy do you think the targets of opportunity are?
Now, what we really want to pick up in investment is like we want the broadening out of investment, right? So you got energy, as I mentioned, infrastructure, and the usual suspects. But then we want for it to broaden out further, because then you want the economy to grow from just this firing on one cylinder, which is like these couple sectors I mentioned, to then fire on to capitalize on what we call this beautiful demographic dividend. And in order for this demographic trends to be dividend, we then need the capex to happen, right? The capex need to happen on the manufacturing side. So how do we get that? How do we get people to then invest in India in a big way, right? They are investing. You do see big projects. You do see that on the trade side, improvements in ICT, like, in terms of export share, the share of the world. But it's growing like too steadily, right? You want an exponential velocity, like kind of like Vietnam, but on a grander scale, right? So how do you do that? first of all, India is a very big country, and it's beautiful in terms of democracy and so on and so forth. It's also very messy, right? And you need you want large scale investment, right? So I'll give you a perspective why Foxconn is very successful in China. If you want to create the iPhone, and when it's a cycle, you need hundreds of thousands of people at work, right? So we're not even talking about we're just talking about assembling this phone and being able to ship it, right? And we're not talking about like being able to create more of the inputs into the phone, right? So which is what China has been able to do, is that it's able to create more. But let's just talk about the logistics of doing this mass scale. If we have labor laws that make it very difficult for a company to fire people without involving the government, more than 300, and even that law itself, which is increasing from 100 to 300, it's not even being implemented evenly across India anyway, which is, again, one of the beauties of decentralization, but also not beautiful if you want something to be done so they capture and change very quickly, right? If you want to be able to acquire a large piece of land to build factories, that's a challenge, right? As I mentioned, land reforms. So India did something to protect landowners, which is then, make it very difficult for a government to do what we call eminent domains, which is the government's right, if it's for the government purpose, to then do whatever it wants, right? So that's not happening relative to China, which, you have many of these stories. So I think that is why investors are, and when we say investors, we mean more of the corporate side. They want this change to be much more rapid, right? And I guess on an individual basis, if you're on the recipient of this change, you want the change to be much more favorable for yourself, and which is the resistance to the change, right? And there has to be an equilibrium to this, right? So if everyone resists change, then we end up with the status quo we are today, which is which I think people are not satisfied. They want change, right? They don't want to work labor away in the agriculture sector, which is where most people are, toiling away with less than a hectare per on average, with very low yields and very volatile yield. And with the weather changing, and even if the government subsidizes fertilizer, and even the government creates a system where the government as an actor will have a certain price in which they buy and help them, so forth and so forth. This current system is not actually working, right? Because it's people are not being able to capture and be part of this growth that Modi is part of, that excitement, the new India, this building expressways and the change, right? So that transformation needs to happen. How do we make that happen is the big question mark. And this is why investors were disappointed when Modi did not get even more mandate than his second term, right? So he won pretty a lot by his first and the second.
So, Trinh, let me just ask you one final question before wrapping up very quickly, which is about trade. You kind of highlighted many areas where you're pretty optimistic. One of the things that you write in some of your research on the trade sector is that you think that bringing down import tariffs, liberalizing trade policies, that could be something that's in the cards to help the manufacturing sector out. Now, if this were to come to pass, it would be music to the ears of many pro-market voices. Do the election results change your assessment about the likelihood of some of that trade liberalization?
Absolutely not. I do think that this is an area of low-hanging fruit that Modi can do, and I think that's something that he can address in the upcoming budget. Even like, and if you look at the budgets, the previous year's budgets, they have been kind of moving in this direction, right? Much of the critiques that people have for India is not participating in RCEP, right? And I would say yes, maybe, but what is RCEP anyway, right? So it's like, first of all, RCP is very different than TPP. TPP is not just about lowering tariffs, but actually reducing the investment barriers. And of course, TPP is dead, right? After Trump came into office, and then so the RCEP, which is championed by China, and now he got a lot of flack for that, right? And I would say that, but just because I think that for India, the one that it should really get is the EU FTA, right? The EU FTA is the one where the EU itself needs more friends. It gave it to Vietnam. Vietnam is and actually one of the key drivers of Vietnam FDI is this liberalization of trade, right? ASEAN tends to be quite neutral and very, very pro trade liberalization, mostly on the tariff side, rather than non-tariff barriers, right? What do we talk about? Non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers tend to be like distribution, barriers. So you don't have tariffs, but hard to distribute the goods, right? You make it like so that only SOEs or certain companies can distribute and so on and so forth. So anyway, long story short, to go back to this India, so let's not lament on the past. I think that Modi is committed, and I think he needs to ride on this geopolitical tailwind and get the EU FTA. The EU FTA, in my opinion, is quite important in that it makes India have something that China doesn't have, which is an EU FTA, right? And much of the arguments that's happening right now about excess capacity and so on and so forth is really the ability to then put anti-dumping measures, right? Which is another retaliatory tariffs. And then so by having this EU FTA, I think, first of all, the EU itself is a huge market. And India also needs friends, and it will be comparatively competitive, right? So companies that not only have tariffs, Chinese companies having tariffs because of the U.S.-China trade war, which people used to say the Trump trade war, but actually it's a Biden plus investment trade war, right? So people that have these issues, and the arbitrage through Southeast Asia, and they then naturally go to Vietnam. So not only are they able to arbitrage the tariffs, they also can then have liberalized access to the EU, right? And I think that's an area that India can do, right? So I completely think that it should be a priority area, and I think that would be a big win for the EU. They did have an FTA with the smaller countries, right, in the EU, but more is being negotiated. And having access to friends with an allow, to have the pull, right? So here we talk about the push of FDI going out, searching for diversification. But then what is the pull? What is India's pull, right? And I think Modi can do more with the pull, right? By building more infrastructure is one, by lowering input costs. If we can have some tariffs reduction, that would help as well. In a targeted way, obviously. If you want to industrialize, I think targeted reduction would be necessary because you'll also be able to, I'm not a protectionist person, but if you don't want to completely liberalize everything, right? So I do think that's an important. And then the liberalization via access to the rest of the market is a lesson that one can learn from Vietnam, that Vietnam has done really well, is that it's very aggressive in trade liberalization. And that's something that India can do, and India can target not just low hanging fruit. This one is not a low hanging fruit, right? It's I would say it's I'm not a negotiating trade and in no way know what's going on in these trade negotiations, but it could be a low hanging but a big fruit, I don't know if there's a phrase for that. Does that make sense?
A low-hanging large
fruit. Because a low-hanging fruit, yes, because people tend to think like a low-hanging fruit is like it's not necessarily the best, the one that you want, but you take it anyway because it's just the closest. But actually, what I wanted to say is that it should be the target, but it may be a low-hanging fruit. It may not be. It may be very difficult. Who knows? But it seems to me like it's an obvious one. It's a no-brainer.
My guest on the show this week is the economist Trinh Nguyen. She's a senior economist covering emerging Asia at Natixis based in Hong Kong. She's also a non-resident scholar in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In the show notes, we will link to some of her work. Trinh, thank you so much for joining us. I know I learned belatedly that it's a holiday there in Hong Kong, so all the more thanks to you for taking the time out to come speak with me.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.